I had a wonderful response from my last video, which people had asked for an outline of my books with recommendations, which to read. And the idea that I'm going to sell lots and lots of books result is really very, very encouraging. But it did occur to me that I didn't want people to buy those books with false expectations. I should say something about my general approach to magic to prepare people for that. What was it that led me to study magic? Well, one of the things was that a life I lived in was so explained, it was so regimented, and it lacked that sort of mystery. And what was I going to do about it? The boringness of everyday life as a kid. Now, people talk about a search for meaning, and to me that's very much what sort of religious quest is, a search for meaning. And you could picture someone sort of going out hunting, you know, whether it's hunting tigers or with a butterfly net running after butterflies and that sort of thing. The hunter is on and very exciting. But with time, we move on to the scientist, who he doesn't call it search for meaning, it's a search for facts. So those butterflies get pinned down and they put into neat cases, not that sort of thing. And so instead of meaning, you have a lovely list of useful facts. Now, the trouble with the hunter-gatherer world is that as the technology of the hunter improves, it begins to kill off the natural world it's in. And so the sort of result of this, as we get better and better at this, is a world where there's less and less meaning. All the butterflies are in their cages, all the animals are now stuffed and they've all been reduced to facts. So what you do now, the move from the hunter-gatherer was towards the agriculturist, the person who, instead of going out and hunting, actually farms, husbands resources, sows seeds and grows nourishment and breeds nourishment. And this to me is the move towards magical thinking, where you actually make everyday life more meaningful. And I always give the example of, you know, the New Ager with his piece of quartz, where he washes it, blesses it, and it turns into a power object. Or the place, which is becomes a place, a sacred place, a sacred spot, and build up the power in it. That to me is magic. It's putting the meaningfulness magic back into the world, sowing it, growing, cultivating it. Now, if you're in the world which is, as it were, meaningless and bleak, what do most people do? Well, one approach is that you can become interested in fantasy. You know, it's a fantasy game or a film series or books which jump you to another world full of magic and wonderful things, you know, and romance and all that. And that's like sort of getting in a plane and flying off to holiday in Bali or some exotic place. And for some people that works really well. I remember when I worked in a huge open plan office, there was this guy, and we laughed at him because he seemed stupid to us. He spent 6 months of the year looking at travel brochures and planning the ultimate holiday. Then he'd go on the ultimate holiday, and he'd spend the rest of the year telling everyone about it until it was time to start planning the next one. We thought that was really pathetic, but then it occurred to me, that guy's a survivor. I couldn't stay in this boring job, but he can because he found a way of surviving in it. It's really rather marvellous, but it just didn't work for me. Because I'm one of those people that if I go to have a fantastic holiday in another place, it makes the world I'm living in seem all the more boring in comparison. I want to be there all the time, you see. So the approach of my books is not as dramatic as that. It doesn't take you to an exotic other world and immediately throwing you into a world of, you know, of psychic forces and this, that, the other, and you know, great gods, demons, and everything like that. It more looks at your everyday world and says, you know, some things here are a bit interesting, you know, and it's like opening doors and finding there's more than you thought. And so instead of sort of like flying to a far country, it's like taking a holiday in your own country. Of course, Britain's an awfully good place for that because it's got a very rich history, you know. Only with going with a walking distance you find some extraordinary things you didn't know were there. And a short drive you find a wonderful museum, in a nearby town you find a beautiful stately home with incredible gardens, you find a lake in a wood, things like that. There's so much you can discover. Now you're not then finding an alternative place to go to. You're actually expanding your kingdom from where you are. You're making it bigger and richer, as reaching out. And that's what I'm trying to do in my books. And so I could present it in this sort of analogy, that you want something more magical, and a person gives you a big bag of morning glory seeds, and you know that you could chew those seeds and have an amazing psychedelic trip. Fantastic. And for some people that would be just exactly what they want. Whereas what I'm saying is, scatter those seeds around your house and water them and do the right things. With any luck, you'll have a house covered with beautiful heavenly blue flowers. And this is not an either or, you see, because after those flowers you have the biggest ever crop of morning glory seeds. You can still do what you want with them then. But at least you had those flowers and you improved your surroundings. So that's the sort of approach. If you really want to go plunge straight into, you know, the weirdest stuff, other people do it better than me. But if you find it hard to swallow all that, explore my books. Get a bit of magic in your surrounding world, and then you can go out and do what the hell you like. It all leads you to the same place eventually. The other thing is that I do play tricks on the reader sometimes, and some people might, I think, find that a bit irritating. You know, it's a bit sort of clever to play tricks. But I have been a teacher, and on the whole, I'm trying to do that with a real pedagogical intent. You see, in Words Made Flesh, when I first published that in the mid-80s, people just found it really difficult to see that you could actually have your consciousness inside an alternative reality. You know, it's one thing to sort of have it modelled and then you play around with it on a screen, but actually go inside it. So what I did is I began by incorporating a fiction story into it. And I think that's one of the reasons the book could get published, because people don't like a non-fiction book including fiction story. It seemed wrong. But two reasons. One was that it was an artificial intelligence story. I mean a virtual reality story. It suggested we're living in virtual reality in the end. But also, when the story ended, I said to the reader, if that story worked for you and was vivid, it meant that you in your mind went into this world. And actually it's a world that you had created, because I carefully didn't use many adjectives. When I said the king sat in his council chamber, if you pictured a council chamber that was all oak panelled with, you know, suits of armour and heraldic, this, that and the other, it was your brain that did it, because I never said anything like that. Your brain constructed a three-dimensional world that you could have experiences in and meet people, humans in it, thinking, feeling human beings. That was the story. And you see, so if you insist that your brain is nothing more than an information processing device, then I have shown you that an information processing device can create a three-dimensional world that you can actually enter into and experience. So it was a sort of trick to illustrate something which some people are finding hard to swallow. In another, I remember there's a story, one of the articles in what I did in my holidays, at a time when there were these horrible accusations being made by sort of right-wing Christian groups, you know, that all pagans were Satanists eating babies and all that sort of stuff and everything like that. And I wrote an essay discussing this, you know, and sort of why it's nonsense and so on and so forth. And so that came to the point, I said, you know, so we definitely have a problem here. The thing is it a serious problem? Does it matter? And I said, I'll tell you one example which we can tell whether how serious it is. And I recounted this account of a really horrible, you know, some sort of hippie, new agey family that had been chastised in a far one of these Bible Belt American towns, really badly treated, and the whole community sort of ganged up against them, you know, and the police couldn't get any facts that, you know, that when they were hurt and things like that. Really unpleasant example of sort of bigotry in that. And I said at the end, now just pause, stop and think. What would you do about that? And I said, if your reaction was, I'd get those bastards and I'd take them to justice, I'd really sympathise. But actually the only right reaction is test the facts. So I made the whole thing up. I just put together all the cliches of, you know, right-wing, dogmatic Christianity, sticking together, you know, xenophobia. I put all those cliches together and made up that story. Now the thing is, if you just took it without questioning it, you really ought to sympathise with those right-wing Christians who only have to hear about a pagan group drinking blood or eating babies or whatever, and they immediately believe it and get furious and want to take action because you've done just the same thing. You see, it's a trick to play on the reader, but it really sort of, people said that really brought it home to them, just how bad the problem was, and what really has to be done about it. And I faced something similar in the Good, the Bad, the Funny, which could really annoy people because I plunged the reader at the beginning into a very sexist discussion about, you know, men liking women with big tits or with good legs, things like that. And after a few pages of that, I say, how do you feel about this stereotyping that we've been doing? And I said, you may feel furious about me writing these stereotypes of women, but actually if you read carefully, I wasn't stereotyping women, I was stereotyping men's expectations of women, their stereotypes. Now, why has it not worked? Because however reasonable what I was saying it on a battlefield. For thousands of years, the battle of sexes. When I start speaking, it's very easy to start polarizing either for me or against me. Now, what if, instead of this line between man, woman, man, woman, man, woman, man, woman, God, devil, us, them, you had a two-dimensional space by bringing in a third factor? What if you couldn't think man, woman without also thinking child, man, woman, child, man, woman, child, man, woman, child? Suddenly you're in a two-dimensional space. And so, for instance, man, woman could make a child. Man, woman, so very different, they both were once a child. The man can decide to play the child to the woman and be the poor-eyed Turnus who makes her laugh, does romantic things, surprises her. Or the woman can play the child to the man, flutter her eyelashes, be a little girl and bring out the fatherliness in him. We're no longer on a battlefield, we're on a dance floor. There are so many possibilities amongst all those terrible cliches, things like that. It's a dance floor. Follow the moves. Yeah, that's what I was putting forward in that book. And I say, I sort of played the dirty trick of putting you onto that battlefield and say, now look what's happened, you know, and could we get a better world than that? So that could infuriate you, or you could see what I was trying to do. I do play tricks like that sometimes, and because that sort of trickster element is always around. So that's my books. They may not be quite the same as other magic books, but I think they go well with other magic books. They're a good complement, and enjoy them.